Hello again, bonjour à tout le monde. Cher Monsieur Descola, dear Mr. Descola, nous sommes très heureux de vous accueillir ici aujourd'hui. Cependant, naturellement, nous sommes aussi également très tristes de ne pas vous avoir ici en présence. Et nous espérons de vous pouvoir le faire, de vous avoir en présence à un autre moment, avec un peu plus de temps, probablement l'année prochaine. We are very happy to welcome you here today, but we are also a bit sad not to be able to actually welcome you here, and we do still hope to be able to make up for this at another time and then also meet you here in Tübingen, maybe in 2022. Si un jour, par exemple, vous venez ici, on va par exemple pouvoir sortir de cette maison et après seulement 20 mètres là-bas, passer devant la maison Cotta, la maison d'édition où les écrits d'Alexandre von Humboldt ont été publiés. Jean reparlera dans un moment. If you could have Philippe Descola ici, here with us, we could walk out of this house and only 20 meters from here we would pass the Cotta House, one of the most famous publishing houses in the 18th century, and there were published the writings of Alexander von Humboldt and something about why we would have a walk with Philippe Descola in front of the Cotta House I will explain a little bit later. Philippe Descola first studied philosophy before moving on to ethnology. He undertook an ethnographic study from 1976 to 1979 with indigenous people in Ecuadorian Amazon. His special focus was the environment, and so his first book, La Nature Domestique, published in 1986, analyzes the ecology of the Achuar indigenous people as a network of sociability that connects the human and non-human actors. So already in the 70s and 80s. This research became the topic of a doctoral thesis under the supervision of Claude Lévi-Strauss. Appointed professor to the chair in anthropology of nature at the Collège de France from 2000 to 2019, Philippe Descola has given lectures in over 40 universities and academic institutions abroad, published books and over 120 scientific articles and chapters of books. And you understand that I can't cite even part of it here. He received so many awards and distinctions. From them, I can only mention the CNRS Gold Medal in 2012. In Germany, I'm absolutely sure the best-known publication is from 2005, Par de la Nature et Culture, translated into German, Spanish, and English. There he proposes a new approach to understanding the distribution of continuities and discontinuities between humans and non-humans. His approach is based on a structural concept of ontology, understood as classification system for the qualities of living beings and a systematic approach to the relationships that unite them. Philippe Descola, and thus also his working group at the Collège de France, had the denomination Anthropology of Nature, Anthropologie de la Nature. This was also the title of his first inaugural lecture held in 2001. This lecture opens with reflection on the importance of Alexander von Humboldt, and this is why I mentioned the house you can walk around when you come visiting us here in Tübingen. When he studied, says Descola, when Alexander von Humboldt, studied a phenomenon as a geographer or a botanist, he did so with a view to linking it to other phenomena found in the same environment while still taking into account historical and sociological facts. He would then endeavor to eliminate the relations thus revealed by examining similar situations in other regions of the world. Humboldt was thus not only a structuralist avant la lettre, but also to a certain extent the godfather of Descola's chair or denomination, emphasizing the continuity of a fundamental anthropology program that the author of Cosmos was one of the first to outline, to understand the unity of humans through the diversity of the means they employ to objectify a world from which they cannot be dissociated. This is also a citation from the first lecture in the Collège de France. And I finish with the last lectures, not the first, but the final lecture in the Collège de France 2019. Qu'est-ce que comparer is the title, what is comparing, is the title of this farewell lecture after 20 years of Collège de France. One can listen to these to the individual sessions on the site of the Collège de France, and if I could really, I would make this required reading for all who work in the humanities. Reflecting on comparisons, similarities and dissimilarities, points of views, judgments, perspectives and conclusions, it is a comprehensive and impressive bilan of an anthropologie de la nature. As we can see, says Descola, anthropology has constantly been faced with the problem of the relations of continuity and discontinuity between nature and culture, a problem that had often been said to constitute the chosen field of this original form of knowledge. Monsieur Descola, on est très content de vous avoir avec nous, même si c'est que sur l'écran. We are very happy to have you, at least on the screen with us, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this very generous presentation, and thank you also to Niels Weidmann for inviting me to speak in front of this distinguished audience. What I will say will, as you will see, resonate with what Professor Ogoudet just said, which shows that the cleverness of the organizers in selecting the speakers. In fact, in many ways, I will repeat some of the topics that he brought upon. The new climatic regime into which we have entered, sometimes referred to as the Anthropocene, has rendered pathetically inadequate, or rather the inadequacy itself of the words we use to describe the realities that surround us or that we aspire to know. How can we still label as a natural phenomenon? It's something we hear every day, a natural phenomenon, a state of affairs, the climate, the anthropogenic dimensions of which are becoming increasingly manifest. Conversely, how can we continue to speak of the environment, which is even a word which is even more used than a natural phenomenon, the environment by which we mean what surrounds humans, when the science of ecosystems has taught us that the interactions between organisms and their milieu must be understood from a systemic point of view and not as the sole backdrop of a single species, however disruptive it may be. However, this kind of mismatch between words and things is a phenomenon that anthropologists have long experienced. Since the key notions of the social sciences, they are supposed that they are, in a way that they are led to use as a common language, turns out to be quite unfaithful to the realities they are supposed to describe, as soon as they concern worlds whose values, practices, and institutions are entirely different from the one they come from. The key notions of the social sciences, terms such as culture and of course nature, society, history, economy, politics, religion, art, etc., certainly made it possible to illuminate the collective condition of Europeans and to label phenomena that were in the process of taking on perceptible autonomy between the beginning of the 18th and the end of the 19th century. This was the crucial period during which were forged the main concepts that allowed Europe to define itself reflexively as a collective rooted in a particular historical process. And yet, because of the very circumstances of their genesis, these concepts are anything but trans-historical. On the contrary, they result from an entirely singular social and cultural trajectory. So in spite of their being obviously linked to the historical destiny of modern Europe, to its emancipation from the political structures of the Ancien Régime, and to its invention of industrial capitalism, these local concepts have nevertheless been reused by the social sciences to describe and analyze non-European polities as if their descriptive validity was universal. So this tranquil conviction that European bourgeois societies could serve as a yardstick for qualifying any form of association has much to do with the evolutionist ideology dominant in the formative period of the social sciences, which saw all forms of human assemblages as destined to go through the same stages and perhaps one day, with the help of colonization, of course, become proper societies, similar to the societies found in Europe, with the same kind of institutions, the same kind of division between economic, political, and ideological bodies. In the meantime, these exotic would-be societies were supposed to remain merely imperfect prefigurations of that future, in the blurred forms of which anthropologists could discern their eventual realization as complete societies similar to our own. So we have here a constitutive paradox of modern anthropology. The Eurocentrism of the concepts that this discipline uses indicates an amputation of the principle of relativism deployed by ethnologists since the beginning of the 20th century. Relativism, understood here as a method and not as a moral imperative, developed by the first generation of field ethnographers, consisted simply in not taking the values and the institutions of the observer as templates by which to calibrate the values and the institutions of the peoples observed. And ethnologists followed faithfully and efficiently this principle whenever they described and analyzed kinship systems and types of family groupings, forms of exchange of goods and services, and theories of the person, or modes of categorizations of plants and animals. In none of these domains were European institutions taken as anthropological universals. whether it was a question of the monogamous heterosexual family, the capitalist market, the linear classification of natural kinds, or the Cartesian conception of the body as res extensa and of the mind as res cogitans. Now, this principle of methodological relativism, so skillfully and efficiently employed in the study of domains such as kinship, such as the circulation of values, such as ontogenesis or biological knowledge, this principle was not pursued to its final consequences, that is, to the calling into question of the general framework within which our values and institutions had taken shape. And this general framework is the ontology familiar to us in the West, which I have labeled naturalism. Naturalism is an ontology based or furnished with beings and states of affairs that appear unsurprising to us. It's furnished with things like society, like nature, like progress, like cultural habits, a clear separation between things and persons, between scientific knowledge and religious belief, between facts and values. But these beings and states of affairs do not exist under this guise in other ontologies, if they exist at all. Thus, by taking stock of the historically contingent character of the naturalist ontology, I do not advocate hyper-relativism. My ambition is rather the reverse, to elaborate analytical tools that would be less affected by the historical particularisms and biases from which the concepts of social sciences presently suffer. Gravitational force, photosynthesis, the chemical formula of water qualify objects and phenomena whose principles of composition and functioning are everywhere identical on Earth. But this does not hold true of notions such as society, culture, or nature, which cut up the texture of the world along structuring patterns that are proper only to specific places and to a specific period. Structuring patterns which are thus perfectly relative while being unduly claimed to be just the opposite. This is why I deemed necessary to push the reflection forward by not contenting myself with the critique of this or that notion of from the sociological repertoire, and by moving to a deeper level of the making of shared worlds, to the level of the detection of regularities in our surroundings, regularities which, when they become systematized, render possible forms of collectives, conceptions of the subject, theories of action, epistemic modes, conceptions of duration and spatiality, which are common to a large social universe, or to large social universes. So by proceeding in such a manner, I no longer consider societies as already constituted realities to be studied, that is, as assemblages of humans who follow self-imposed sets of conventions. Instead, I try to understand how specific collectives come about. Only some of them see themselves as societies. So the ontological approach I adopt amounts to this. It is not a statement about what the world in general is or ought to be, but rather an inquiry into the diverse ways according to which humans select certain features from the objects whose existence they infer from their surroundings in order to compose worlds out of this material. And it is because these primary modalities of identifications of the world vary that the forms of collectives that humans invent will vary accordingly. They will be immersed in political configurations, types of exchange, and kinds of relations between themselves and with non-humans that will be quite different and will change over time. So my ambition is thus to bring to a more elementary level the critical aim of the social sciences so as to render them better equipped for the task of grasping the general forms of interaction between beings. Obviously, we are not here within the realm of the social sciences alone. Our concern is not just with integrated groups of humans. What is at stake, and I appreciate the reference to Humboldt, because I think this was one of his projects. What is at stake is the interactions to be studied and qualified within these diverse assemblages unfold between agents with different ontological statuses. Humans, to be sure, but also organisms of various kinds, artifacts, representations, physical affordances and effects, deities and spirits, images, physical milieu, and all the other elements with which worlds are composed. So the science that would be in a position to study these kinds of complex objects would then be a general science of relations, an ecology in the broadest sense of the term, a science yet to come, and to which any discipline could contribute in as much as it deals with what might be termed interagentivity, which is very close to what Professor Ogude calls co-agency. Interagentivity, that is the process which brings about emerging properties as a result of the interactions between humans and non-humans agents that possess different dispositions, but are nevertheless capable of being affected by each other. It should be obvious by now that if I place this enterprise under the auspices of ontology, it was not to claim an annexation by anthropology of a domain formerly reserved for philosophy, although as it was said, my initial training was in philosophy. Rather, it was mainly to emphasize the fact that the level at which I believe anthropological analysis should situate itself is more elementary than the one where it has operated until now. One cannot explain the systems of differences in the properly human ways of inhabiting the world by conceiving of these differences as the derived product of such and such a type of institution, of economic organization, of technical infrastructure, of regimes, of values, of visions of the world, etc. In short, any of the aspects of collectives that the social sciences hypostasize into separate domains in order to bring out causal determinations. Like Professor Agoudet, I was, like I think most people in our generation, a Marxist to begin with. And so this perspective I am developing now is in a way an attempt at trying to extract myself from these causal determinations of institutions. Rather, I think, each of these aspects that I've just mentioned can be seen as the stabilized outcome of more fundamental intuitions and inferences as to what the world contains and as to what kind of relations its human and non-human components maintain. So the word ontology seemed appropriate for designating this analytical level, which could also be qualified as pre-predicative in the language of Husserlian phenomenology, which was the other branch of philosophy, which was extremely important to us when we were students in philosophy many, many years ago. And this is why this is the reason why I began to use this notion of ontology parsimoniously and more than 2 decades ago. So if I have contributed to the so-called ontological turn, an expression that I never use myself, it thus has been out of a need for conceptual hygiene. One has to look for the roots of the diversity of human behavior at a deeper level than the one that ethnography reveals, at the level of the differences in the basic inferences humans make as to what kind of beings inhabit the world and as to the ways in which these beings are bound together. And from there ensue the types of collectives within which life is lived in common, the nature of its compositions or their composition, etc. From there ensue the regimes of temporality, forms of figuration. From there ensues, in fact, all the richness of social and cultural life. Such a perspective might allow treating cosmopolitics in all their diversity without falling into an Eurocentric bias. How should we proceed to achieve that? First of all, by admitting that the main difference between extra-modern, I don't like the use non-modern or pre-modern because of course, of the evolutionist undertone of it. So I rather use the word extra-modern because in some cases, extra-modern peoples are quite deliberate in non-being modern. So how are we to understand new forms of cosmopolitics And so first, by admitting that the main difference between extra-modern cosmopolitics and modern political institutions, this main difference stems from the fact that the former extra-modern polities are capable of integrating non-humans into mixed collectives, or of treating non-humans as political subjects operating in their own collectives, different from the collectives of humans, while the latter confine the latter, that is the modern political institutions, confine non-humans to ancillary functions, that is, surrounding humans as their environment, providing resources to them, or offering food for symbolic thought, which is another great aspect of non-humans for the moderns. If we admit that, then we must also admit that the kinds of collectives which constitute the milieu where life unfolds in parts of the world which are still resisting the front of modernization differ from the ones we recognize in the West. For their collectives, extra-modern collectives, assemble humans and non-humans in different ways. For instance, if one looks closely at the components of what anthropologists call a descent group in our language, in our jargon, is either a clan, a lineage, a sib, a moiety, or any similar unit. And anthropology defines a descent group as a set of humans descending from a common ancestor. If we use this notion of a descent group not as it is conceived by us, but by the peoples where such unit exists, then one realizes that they contain these units much more than humans. I'll take two brief examples from different parts of the world. Among the Wodabe Pearl of Fulani of Niger, the word Dudal is ordinarily employed by anthropologists to designate a fraction of a lineage, that is the largest segmentary unit functioning as a corporate group. However, as Angelo Bonfiglioli has shown in a monograph, Dudal, this word Dudal, refers in fact both to a line of humans and to a line of Zebu that humans have selected over a number of generations. So a group of humans and a group of domestic animals, the Dudal lineage and the Dudal herd, thus form a continuous and imbricated totality referred to by a single term. The same thing can be said of a notion used by the Tuva herders of Siberia. The word is Al-Kodan. Its meaning is even more encompassing than Dudal, for Al-Kodan refers at the same time to an encampment, to its human inhabitants, to its dogs and cattle, to its yurts, to its enclosures, and to its neighboring pastures, with the results that humans, non-humans, and land are all incorporated into such a notion. And the solidarity of all members of this ontologically mixed collective, ontologically mixed for us, of course, but not for them, is rendered evident in times of crisis. When cattle are plagued by disease, for example, humans have nightmares. And this is seen as a sure indication that the Al-Qudan is being attacked by malevolent spirits. As a consequence, it is the whole Al-Qudan that must be treated by a shaman. In other words, in the clan, in the lineage, in the totemic group, in the Dudal, in the Al-Qudan, there is always much more than women, men, and children alive or dead. Dead, of course, referring to the ancestors. There are also animals, plants, territories, deities, spirits, sanctuaries, pathogens, elements of knowledge, types of expertise, images, and 1,000 other beings or things essential to life. And all these components of the collective are there ab initio. They are constitutive of the mixed units that these segments form. They are not added afterwards as either a suggestive decor for the theater of human actions or as mere purveyors of metaphors. So the idea that anthropology's unit of analysis is provided solely by humans therefore constitutes a blockage that has obfuscated the properly political dimensions of collective life outside of modern societies. It is from this conception of politics, at once anthropo and Eurocentric, that I wish to break. To do this, we must get rid of a number of prejudices. That is, we must become aware that the concepts we use to describe extra-modern collectives qualify situations that are essentially characteristic of modern societies. I will mention only two aspects of this trend. The first one concerns the notion of the idea of appropriation, and more specifically, appropriation of a territory. This is a notion that historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, whatever the historical situation they are concerned with, have been using extensively to describe the relationship of a collective to the place it inhabits, even though it is typically the product of a legal and philosophical system which is quite specific to the West. Since the beginning of the enclosure movement in England, Europe first, then other parts of the world in its wake, have continuously transformed an ever-increasing part of the earth into alienable and privately appropriated goods. This, by no means universal, movement of mercantilization was made partly possible by a conception of appropriation as the act by which an individual or a community becomes holder of a right over a component of the world. A conception closely linked to modern political philosophy as it was developed in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in England, that was summarized by Macpherson under the term, among others, of possessive individualism. However, for many extra-modern collectives, this configuration makes little sense, if only because in many of these extra-modern collectives, especially in non-European kingdoms, which have still survive, but have mostly disappeared, the power of the sovereign is concerned with the control of humans or the control of cosmic fertility, but not directly with the control of land. But it is also the very notion of territory that needs to be questioned here. Because in an extra-modern context, territory rarely corresponds to what we have been accustomed to conceiving under this term since the emergence in Europe of the Westphalian system, namely the idea that a portion of space exists over which a state exercises its sovereignty and whose stable limits are recognized by neighboring states. It is indeed common that the same physical space can be used by different human groups. And this is, of course, the case of the sharing of different resources in the same milieu by farmers and hunter-gatherers or nomadic pastoralists. Examples are legion in Africa and South America and in Asia. It also happens that a human collective uses different spaces constituting a discontinuous territory, sometimes sharing portions with other human collectives. Moreover, the use of territory is not under the control of the humans alone. It is also dependent upon a host of non-humans with whom humans must deal or on whom they depend, as well as on the agency ascribed to these entities: deities, spirits, genii, ancestors, ghosts, plants, animals, meteors, features of the topography, mountains, etc., etc. I have repeatedly used to talk about these things the term collective. Unlike other categories that designate organized groups of beings, notably, of course, the concept of society, the concept of collective has the huge merit of not prejudging the content of what is associated or of the modes of assembling. So employing the concept of collective eliminates, for one, the ontological disjunction between groupings of humans, society, nation, community, lineage, tribe, ethnic group, etc., and groupings of non-humans, species, herd, band, technical sector, pantheon, collection, etc., etc. It is, of course, not the case that all forms of association are identical, quite the contrary. But their typology should not rest any longer on the elementary distinction between humans and non-humans that underlies the regime of modernity. How can we define a collective? In the sense in which I take it, a collective is a stabilized form of association between beings that can be either ontologically homogeneous or ontologically heterogeneous, and whose composition or principles of composition and modes of relations between the components are both specifiable and susceptible of being reflexively addressed by human members of these assemblages, especially when it comes to a very common exercise, which is qualifying relations with neighboring collectives, where these principles and modes do not apply. We can therefore conceptualize humans and non-humans associated in totalities governed by unitary principles. This is what corresponds to the examples I gave earlier of the Fulani Dudal or of the Tuva camp. It is also possible to conceptualize monospecific assemblages of humans interacting with monospecific assemblages of non-humans who abide by identical rules of sociability. This is what I observed in the upper Amazon. It's the case of all the, what I call animist collectives, not only in Amazonia, but in other parts of the world, such as Northern Siberia, for instance. These kinds of assemblages are not surprising for anthropologists. They are the usual forms under which extra-modern peoples present themselves to us in all the imaginative diversity of their institutions. Collectives thus exist in stabilized, even canonical forms, which social and political anthropology has certainly described in a fragmentary and anthropocentric manner, but which it is not impossible to restore in all the richness and complexity of their architecture. Moreover, their compositional principles are quite explicit for the humans who are members of them and who know very well how to evaluate their merits in relation to those of neighboring ones. This is why I have hypothesized that the principles of composition of a collective, that is to say, what determines the nature of the beings it associates and the possible links they can maintain together, ultimately depends on what I've called modes of identification. Let me recall in a few words what all this is about. The general idea is that the apparent diversity of cultural habits must be seen as the direct product of differentiated processes of worlding. That is, ways of actualizing the multitude of qualities, phenomena, beings, and relationships that can be objectified by humans through the ontological filters that serve to discriminate between everything that their environment affords to them. I've called modes of identifications these ontological filters that structure worlding. They are cognitive and sensory motor patterns incorporated, embodied, and developed during socialization in a particular physical and social milieu, which function as schematization devices for our practices, intuitions, and perceptions, without necessarily, and in most cases, mobilizing discursive knowledge. In other words, it is this kind of mechanism that allows us to recognize certain things as significant and ignore others, to string together sequences of actions without having to think about them, to interpret events and statements in a certain way, to channel our inferences without about the properties of the world surrounding us without being conscious of it. Yet, despite the diversity of qualities that we can detect in beings and things, or that we can infer from clues offered by their appearance and behavior, it is plausible to think that the ways in which these qualities are organized are not very numerous. Our judgments of identity, that is, the recognition of similarities between objects or events, cannot depend on analytic comparisons carried out term by term. For reasons of cognitive economy, they must be able to be made quickly and non-consciously by induction from shared schemas that are devices for structuring perceived qualities and organizing behavior. I therefore made the hypothesis that there were no more than 4 modes of identifications, that is, 4 ways of systematizing ontological inferences, each based on the kinds of resemblance and differences that humans detect between themselves and non-humans on a double level, which is physical and moral. And indeed, when faced with any other being, human or non-human, I can assume either that this being has elements of physicality and interiority identical to mind, and I've called this totemism, or that this being's interiority and physicality are distinct from mine, and I've called this analogism, or that we have similar interiorities and heterogeneous physicalities, and I've called this animism, or that our interiorities are different and our physicalities are analogous, and I've called this naturalism, which is the regime under which we live here in the West. I will not go into the details of these modes of identification, the characteristics of which I've described in several of my books. What has been important to me in recent years is to test the relevance of these schemes by examining their analytical purchase in accounting for structural variations in diverse fields of practice and representation. Contrary to the most common approach in the social sciences, it is not the dominant categories of social life that serve here as a template for thinking about the world. On the contrary, it is the organizing principles of cosmologies, the nature of the beings that populate them, and the relation that they are free to weave between themselves that will define the singular form taken by these exclusive assemblages of humans that we call societies. Assemblages that the sociology of the modern chopped up from the fabric of the world so as to transform them into the model of all collective existence. So my hypothesis is the reverse.
Mr. Descola?
Yes?
Please excuse me. You would have 1 more minute? Is it okay?
I have almost finished.
Okay, great. Sorry for the interruption.
Not at all.
Okay.
My hypothesis is the reverse. It is the more elementary principles analytically prior to these social categories that generate the assemblages of humans and non-humans that I call collectives, and that condition the characteristics of the latter. So for me, the ontological and cosmological level determines and explains the sociological level, not the other way around. So just a final word on cosmopolitics taken into that perspective. How can new cosmopolitics be conceived in this perspective? First of all, by reconceptualizing what should be a common good, that is, by extending the perimeter of what this notion of common good means well beyond the usual objects, to also include the climate, biodiversity, the atmosphere, knowledge, health, the plurality of languages, unpolluted milieux, etc., etc. And this obviously implies overturning the usual notion of appropriation, to which I return now, as the act by which an individual or a collective becomes holder of a right over a component of the world, and to envisage a system in which it would be rather ecosystems or systems of interaction between humans and non-humans that would be the bearer of rights of which humans would only be usufructuaries. In such a case, appropriation would run from the milieu to humans and not the other way around. Such a revolution should lead to a change in the mechanism of representation. By this, I mean the delegation of responsibility or free will that would allow agents involved in human and non-human collectives to make their point of view known by proxy in the deliberation upon common affairs. In the spirits of what I've just said about appropriations, it seems essential that the greatest possible number of agents contributing to the common life should see their situation represented, not as individuals, because that would be falling into line with the modern perspective, not as individuals then endowed with interesting rights, be they human, multinationals or chimpanzees, but as associations of beings residing in specific milieus, whether whatever the nature of this milieu, watersheds, mountain ranges, cities, coastlines, neighborhoods, ecologically sensitive area. So a true, and this is the basic notion that I would like to push, a true political ecology, a fully fledged cosmopolitics then, cannot be satisfied with conferring intrinsic rights on nature without giving it real means of exercising them, as, for instance, the Constitution of Ecuador did a few years ago. It must strive to ensure that particular milieus and everything that makes them up, including humans, become political subjects of which humans would be the agents. I will conclude with that. It is a situation which is very common in many parts of the world still, where ethnology and history offer us many examples of collectives in which the status of humans is not derived from the universal capacities deemed universally attached to the person, but from their membership in a singular collective that indissolubly combines territories, plants, mountains, animals, site deities, and scores of all other beings. In such systems, in a word, humans do not own nature, they are owned by it. And it's interesting, and this is my last word, that the settlers of the ZAD, zone à défendre, zone to be defended, in Notre-Dame-des-Landes in Western France, are fond of saying, we do not defend nature, we are nature defending itself. Thank you.